For lab 4, we analyzed the movement of an oscillating spring in motion. So to do so, we were able to create a predicted position model to compare to our observed position model and see how these two relate to one another in terms of the oscillation of the spring. We're able to calculate this predicted position through Newton's second law, energy principle, and spring properties. So here are some of the formulas we use. We use some of our fundamental principles such as Newton's second law, Hooke's law, force of gravity, our F net equations, our kinetic energy equations, gravitational potential energy, spring potential energy, our total energy, period of oscillation, stiffness of the spring, and the relaxed length of the spring. Okay, so our first step was to upload our video into Tracker to extract position points for the motion of the object. So we were able to get our initial position, our initial velocity, which is 0 since it does start at rest, our period of oscillation, our spring constant, and our relaxed length of the spring. And then from this, we're also able to know that our constant values include our length and our mass. So our next step was to input some of our data into GlowScript. So we were able to plug in our mass of the ball, our initial position vector, and our initial velocity vector. Then we were able to plug in our spring constant that we solved for, our relaxed length of the spring, which we also solved for, our equations for L hat, and S for the orientation of the spring. We plugged in our equations for kinetic energy, gravitational potential energy, spring potential energy, and total energy. We also plugged in our gravitational force, our spring force, our net force, Newton's second law, and our position update formula. So all those formulas and values are right here. So for our next step, we plugged in L hat, L, and S again for an update in the orientation of the spring. So we updated those equations. And then we plugged in our change in energy equation, such as our delta K value, our delta potential energy of gravity value, our delta potential energy of the spring value, and our delta of the total energy. So for our computational models we were able to get out the motion of the spring model. So our motion is right in this blue area here. Our observed versus predicted motion in the x direction and y direction, and our change in energy of kinetic energy, gravitational potential energy, spring potential energy, and change in total energy. So our results. So the comparison of the observed and predicted position of the mass in both the x and y directions. Our red is going to be our observed motion, and our blue is going to be our predicted motion. And I also put in our tracker values for that observed motion as well to compare kind of these two different values. So for the model and the experiment, so we're able to see that these lines are relatively close to one another. However, the model is a little bit of a more accurate oscillation, which is more of a constant value there, and a more constant oscillation. But we can see that both in the x and the y direction, both of these experiment and model are both oscillating in the same way. So for the results of our comparison of energy changes, so our blue is a kinetic energy, red is spring potential energy, green is gravitational potential energy, and yellow is our total energy. So we can see that our spring potential energy and gravitational potential energy are relatively equal and opposite forces, while our delta K is right here, and our total energy is 0. Our change in total energy is 0. So with our change in total energy being 0, we can see that the energy principle is satisfied since energy is being conserved and nothing is changing with the total energy, since it does in fact remain at 0. And then for our oscillation periods of the x and y axis, we can see that the x direction does move a little bit faster in terms of oscillation than the y direction, which could be due to the force of gravity and the spring force on the y direction and not so much on the x direction, giving us a faster oscillation period for the x direction, since it does not include these forces. So critiques and conclusions. I really enjoyed this lab and I thought the models were really helpful. At first I was a little confused on how our tracker positions could really translate to that oscillation, so it was really cool to see that model come out and see where our position points really lied on that oscillating system. So I think I could have gotten a little bit more accurate data by using more position values while solving for the oscillation of the spring. However, I do think it was better that I found the average of 3 different values of the oscillation period instead of just one. So for our conclusion, through this lab, we were able to use Newton's second law and the energy principle to predict a spring oscillation motion. And through obtaining the predicted motion, we are able to see energy conserved by the spring and compare oscillations of both the position and energy changes. And with comparing the predicted position to the model, it is really helpful to be able to see how this motion is really oscillating and how energy is conserved throughout the entire motion of the system.